Chapter 10, America Recovers, 1865 to 1880. Part 2, Grant as President, the 1868 national election. The Republicans were quick to nominate Civil War hero Grant as their party's candidate for president in the 1868 elections. The Democrats dumped Johnson and nominated New York Governor Horatio Seymour, whose white racist views made him appear to be opposed to the North's tough Reconstruction policies. Thus, 500,000 black votes helped Grant win 53% in this election with an unusually high voter turnout. But the Electoral College, as usual, skewed the vote in favor of the winning candidate, Grant with 214 electoral votes to Seymour's 80. The election was so close that Republicans realized that if Confederates disqualified by the 14th Amendment had been able to vote, plus the 3 reconstructed southern states not yet allowed to vote, the election would have gone badly for the Republicans. Sensing that any potential Democratic victory would undo the Republican Party's Reconstruction program, Congress was quick to put into place the 15th Amendment, make it illegal for a state to deprive a citizen of the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. As a condition for readmission to the Union, the last 3 holdout southern states, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia, had to approve both the 14th and 15th Amendments, thus adding the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870. Corruption on a grand scale. But Grant as president was going to be much less aggressive than he had been as a general. Tragically, he tended to trust too much those he had placed in positions of authority, and tended to be slow to check out rumors of corruption rampant in his administration, or at least within the higher realm of politics, within the America he was supposed to be inspiring and directing. Grant himself was not involved in the corruption, and often did act, usually belatedly, when a national scandal broke out. The Fisk-Gould gold scandal. A scandal that erupted early during the Grant administration was the effort in 1869 by Wall Street tycoons Jim Fisk and Jay Gould to corner the American gold market. Buying up all the gold they could at $135 an ounce, thus diminishing the nation's gold supply, and driving up the price of gold at $160 an ounce, they anticipated gaining a huge windfall profit when they finally unloaded their gold. But Grant learned of their scheme and stepped in to release some of the federal government's gold supply, thus bringing down the price of gold. Fisk and Gould thus come away with a much smaller profit than they had anticipated. Sadly, although Grant's action was quite correct, his administration could not escape the tendency of people to blame the president for allowing this to happen in the first place. The Credit Mobilier scandal, an even bigger scandal, broke out when the public got wind in 1872 of the widespread corruption involved in the huge project of laying railroad track designed to connect the nation east and west. As early as 1862, during the Civil War, the federal government had authorized $100 million in capital to build a 1,750-mile railroad westward from Council Bluffs, Iowa, on the strategic Missouri River, by the Union Pacific Railroad Company, and eastward from the Pacific Ocean at San Francisco by the Central Pacific Railroad Company, through desert, mountains, and unfriendly Indian territory. It was undertaken as a matter of national interest rather than as a money-making capitalist enterprise, because it was not expected that the venture could ever recover its costs simply through the revenues it would acquire when it was actually up and running. It simply had to be built by public funding if necessary. The public funding actually took the form of federal land grants to these railroad companies of approximately 20 million acres, valued at somewhere around $50 to $100 million, and cash loans of around $60 million. The loans to be eventually paid off by the sale of the land granted to the railroad companies. To handle these financial transactions, Union Pacific director Thomas Durant set up the banking firm Crédit Mobilier of America, which, by the way, had no connection whatsoever with the famous French banking company of the same name. Of a questionable nature was that the directors of both the Union Pacific and the Crédit Mobilier happened to be the one and the same individuals. Union Pacific stocks were sold to its directors and also to a number of United States congressmen whose vital votes supported this expensive venture. Some 30 representatives from both parties were involved. There was, by the way, considerable opposition among the general public and in Washington to the venture by those who did not see the strategic need for such an expensive venture. Stocks were sold to these insiders at par value, well under their market value, thus securing enormous profits for these privileged investors. Some estimates put their profits at around $20 million total when they turned around to sell their shares on the open market. Further, the railroads were granted $16,000 for each mile of track laid on flat land, $32,000 for hilly terrain, and $48,000 for mountainous terrain, tempting the companies to wander across as much terrain as possible, and also to exaggerate their claims of miles of track laid, a monumental piece of corruption, which finally in 1872 the New York City newspaper Sun uncovered and ran a damaging expose about, just in time for the 1872 national elections. Once the revelation of the scandals broke in 1872, Union Pacific stock dropped in such value that it left the other stockholders nearly bankrupt. And once again, Grant was blamed by an outraged media for not having intervened to block this whole corrupt venture. But it was a sign of the times. Such scandals, especially related to the hugely lucrative business of railroad construction, which was expanding rapidly everywhere in the country, would unfortunately be very typical of the way America found itself developing economically in the last quarter of the 19th century. Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall. Another scandal of the times, not connected to the Grant administration, however, was the New York City Democratic Party political machine, known popularly as Tammany Hall, operating during Grant's presidency under the leadership of William Boss Tweed. Tammany Hall was originally set up as an organization designed to help immigrants, notably the Irish, get established in America. Such assistance, of course, came with the expectation that the immigrants would then support the organization when it came time for local elections, ensuring Democratic Party control of the city and all of its patronage jobs. Boss Tweed, who took over the organization in 1863, served on a number of city and state committees and boards, and even on the New York State Senate, 1868 to 1873. He eventually ended up controlling much of the New York State legislature, New York courts, the city treasury, and the huge cash flow that accompanied his various positions. He was reported to have helped Jay Gould and Jim Fisk take control, 1866 to 1868, of the Erie Railroad from the equally adventuresome Cornelius Vanderbilt, with faked stock, which Boss Tweed was able to get the New York State Legislature to authorize, receiving a considerable share of that stock himself, plus a position on the company's board of directors. The amount of graft that Boss Tweed acquired is still uncertain. It was so extensive. He was accused and tried in a series of court cases starting in 1873 for stealing from the New York taxpayers an amount ranging from $25 to $45 million. More recent estimates put that figure at closer to $100 million in 1877 dollars. He was in and out of prison. At one point, he even escaped to Spain until 1878, when he died in prison at age 55. But Tammany Hall itself quietly survived Boss Tweed's demise to conduct business as usual well into the 20th century. The 1872 national election. All this corruption, well covered by the press exposés, naturally called for the need for extensive political reform in the North itself. Consequently, a new political grouping came into being in advance of the national elections, the Liberals. Taking a broader view of the South and the vengeful radicals, the Liberals found themselves joined with the Democrats, ironic for such a reformist grouping since the Democrats were identified closely with Tammany Hall, in calling for a lifting of the heavy-handed Reconstruction program imposed on the South by the North. In anticipation of the 1872 presidential election, they nominated newspaper editor and ardent reformer, even socialist, Horace Greeley, to run against the Republican Party's candidate, President Grant. In the election itself, Grant won handily the vote of the Electoral College, 300 to 60, though Greeley won 44% of the popular vote. Thus, Grant was going to have 4 more years in the White House, but Grant's second term in office would be as troubled as his first term. The 1873 financial panic. The failure of a major brokerage firm, brought down by its heavy involvement in Northern Pacific Railroad bonds, set off a financial panic on Wall Street, which soon led to the collapse of a number of banks and other investment houses. The situation became so bad that Wall Street shut down business for 10 days to cool down the panic. Worse, this crisis was timed with a decision by Grant to remove readily available silver as a standard for the dollar, leaving the dollar reliant only on gold as its metallic standard. While this may have strengthened the dollar, it restricted dramatically the ability of investors and entrepreneurs to gain easy credit for opening up or expanding their business base. This hit particularly hard the massive farming industry, which always relied on bank loans to carry farmers from planting time in the spring until harvest time in the fall, when finally the farmers would see income. Grant did not understand the severity of the financial crisis that hit the country in 1873, thinking the downturn in the nation's economic activity to be nearly a normal fluctuation in the economy, which, by the way, certainly happens from time to time. But this was no mere fluctuation. The economy going into a stall which lasted 5 long years, termed at the time the Long Depression, and which saw almost 90 railroad companies go bankrupt. Grant refused to back down from his tight monetarist strategy, believing that the strong dollar was more important to the nation's economy than the easy credit strategy that the nation had been pursuing, leading to the vast corruption that had sullied the reputations of the railroad and banking companies. But this was a bad time to put additional brakes on the nation's economy, because it would have severe political as well as economic consequences. Because of the 1873 panic, there occurred a major sweep in 1874 of the Republicans out of office everywhere, including the U.S. House of Representatives, where the Democratic Party took control. This did not bode well for a continuation of the North Reconstruction program for the South. the South will rise again. In the meantime, political tensions had been building in the South, where the Democratic Party was regaining political ground under the leadership of former Confederate officials, termed Bourbon or Redeemer Democrats, who had been gathering white political support by stoking the whites' fears of the rising political power that the blacks had acquired through Congress's Reconstruction policies. Also, the KKK was gathering strength and vindictiveness. This, in turn, brought Congress to pass another round of legislation, 1871-1872, designed to protect black voting rights in the South and curb the behavior of the KKK and other Southern organizations like it. But this only inspired even greater bullying behavior on the part of those white racist organizations, making life even more difficult for the Southern black. One by one, these Redeemer Democrats were able to take over the state legislatures of the South and begin the passing of a round of segregationist Jim Crow laws. But in addition to playing the race card as their ticket to power, they employed other populist tactics, such as calling for the end of the huge indebtedness of their state governments by simply repudiating those debts, and by calling for the end of governmental subsidies for business, such as the railroads. It made for great popularity among frustrated white voters, but foolishly undercut the possibility of the South working its way out of its poverty. Now, repudiating debts was a sure way of cutting off any future investments in the Southern economy. And prolonged economic hard times would only harden the attitudes of a racist South. Grant finishes out his presidential term amidst more rumors of massive scandal. Grant's tendency to grant unreserved trust to those he had appointed to office would shake his administration to the core. Worse, he would tend to side with those accused of corruption, seeing them simply as victims of unjust opportunists. Indeed, he seemed totally blind to the corruption going on around him, which was rampant. Payoffs for appointments by officials below him, such as Grant's personal secretary, Babcock, were normal procedure during the Grant years. Within his Treasury Department, a tax collector had set up a scheme to overlook owed taxes until a sufficient amount had accumulated that he could then go in and collect, plus a sizable fine, which went into the tax collector's pocket. Meanwhile, a huge whiskey ring, owing enormous amounts of taxes, some $3 million, on their whiskey, had been allowed to develop, until finally Grant appointed an honest Treasury Secretary who went in and cleaned house. But when Babcock was also implicated in the deal, Grant threw his protection around his personal secretary and even pardoned a number of leaders of the whiskey ring who had been found guilty and imprisoned. Corruption touched everything from the War Department to the Department of the Interior as Grant appointees used their power to extract bribes and other payoffs for their services, becoming simply part of the business as usual in dealing with the federal government. Grant did appoint reformers empowered to clean out such corruption, but the corruption was so extensive that his efforts brought little relief from his growing reputation as running a very corrupt administration. As a consequence, in 1876, the Republican Party distanced itself from him at the convention called to select a new Republican candidate for the presidency.